Welcome, everyone, to our very first podcast. This is going to be Catholicism, Science, and the Paranormal. I'm Chris O'Donnell, a member of the Brothers Sisters of Penance. My co-host, Justin Panalisigi. We're actually the minister and vice minister of the Brothers Sisters of Penance. It's why we wear the habits, hence the name Dirty Habits, because we wear the habit as Franciscans, but we get our hands dirty working in the world, really bringing Christ out there to both sides, those who are interested in the science aspect, those who are interested in the paranormal. We live according to the rule of 1221 that St. Francis himself originally founded. Just so we bring it up right now for future episodes and questions, we are married, so don't freak out or be scandalized if we talk about women and children later. It's part of our association's charism that has married men and women, single men and women, even diocesan clergy can be a part of it. So we want to welcome you to this very first one of our podcasts. We hope to have a lot of them and go into a lot of these supernatural and paranormal and scientific things to help people sort of on both sides of the spectrum find what interests them. And most of all, to really just bring you closer to Christ, or at least bring you closer to the understanding that there really is more out there than what we see. I didn't know if you wanted to start by adding anything, Justin, before we talk about our first topic.
Well, we didn't want anything too controversial for our very first show. You know, there's a lot going on in the church right now that we could talk about that we're going to avoid. And instead, we're going to talk about the very uncontroversial topic of ghosts.
Yes.
the Catholic belief in and traditions surrounding ghosts.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are we drinking today?
Right now, we're drinking some Mother Earth from right here in North County, San Diego. Cali Creamin'. It's delicious. Very sweet.
Really good.
Very sweet.
If you want to sponsor us.
Yeah. I was looking for sponsors.
Okay.
All right. So, Brother Chris, tell us about ghosts. Are we allowed to believe in them? Because I used to be told that we're not allowed to believe in ghosts at all.
All right.
I've had priests tell me it's ridiculous. Souls, when they're gone, or when they depart from this life, they go either up or down, and then we don't really hear from them again if they go down, but we can hear from them again if they go up. So what are we at?
So let's talk about this. First thing, just some real basic stuff. Roughly 1 out of 5 Americans 18 years and older have claimed to have actually had an experience of seeing a ghost. Over 50% of Americans believe in ghosts, even if they haven't actually had an encounter. When you look at, and we're actually low on the spectrum, when you look at countries, especially Asian countries, 98% of Taiwanese people believe in spirits and ghosts. Japanese are well over 70%. So everywhere around the world, there's this phenomenon of ghosts. And a lot of the research I was doing when we were looking at this topic that was interesting, and we won't go into it tonight, but it may be a later thing we speak about, and that is there are about 4 or 5 different scientists from different areas of neuropsychology, biology, etc., that think our brains are actually hardwired to see spiritual, or for lack of a better term, ghosts. So when someone sees or claims to have seen a ghost, it's actually kind of complex, right? Because first of all, we have to admit, there are a lot of fraudulent claims out there. And Justin and I are very excited. We hope to do maybe some even on-site things later as we go along.
Oh,
but we are not ghost hunters, okay? A lot of those things are fraudulent. I love listening to podcasts, creepypastas, but after a while, even a lot of the so-called true stories sound so similar that it almost makes them less credible, because it's so similar. It's more like people are copying one another's stories.
My coworker was a ghost hunter.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She waited one night in our office because she could have sworn there's some weird stuff going on. So she brought her full, I don't even know, what are those devices?
Oh, yeah, the EMT, the detectors.
Yeah. She said there was weird activity.
Well, this actual office, the old secretary Andrea, me, and wasn't it Quinn, our producer's daughter, Teresa, have heard noises in here loud when nobody's here, banging. So I don't know. We'll see. I've never had any problems though so far. But what could be the cause of something when a person says, "Hey, I've had this experience of a ghost"? Well, it could honestly be some paranormal phenomenon. It could be some type of hallucination, and by that, just taking things and sort of putting them together in your mind just because you hear a sound or do this, and you attribute something. And some are actually caused by environmental factors. I mean, it sounds funny, but gas leaks, things like that cause people to have weird experiences. But I guess, like Justin said, what's the big question tonight? Do Catholics believe in ghosts? The short answer is yes, but we have to describe what we as Catholics mean when we talk about ghosts.
I was just going to say, we need a definition of ghost.
Well, and I know we both speak German as part of our training and such, but the word ghost in English comes from the German term Geist, which means
spirit.
So really the term ghost, and maybe if you've read older, even Christian documents, even the versions of the Bible, Dewey Reams, King James, you're going to see what we call the Holy Spirit traditionally nowadays was called the Holy Ghost.
Yeah, and in our traditional Latin Mass community,
right.
That's a big deal. We usually refer to the Holy Spirit as the Holy Ghost.
Right. So one thing's clear. As Christians, whether Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Evangelical, what have you, it is clear that our tradition reveals the truth of the existence of non-human spirits, which, for lack of a better term, we call Elohim. Later, we'll differentiate to angels, demons, those kind of things. We also, in addition, believe that the disembodied souls of deceased human beings continue to exist in some state after death, awaiting the final time of the resurrection. So the first thing to do is we're going to narrowly focus our meaning. We are going to focus completely on disembodied human spirits. So we're not going to have any speaking today or discussion really about angels, demons. We also want to include things like out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, because for the simple reason that people actually are not dead. So we're going to focus, what a ghost is for us is the disembodied soul of a human being that has passed on. So when we look at that, the Bible really has very little to say about such things, both Old and New Testament. Often, this is because it had little impact on the lives of the Hebrews. Unlike all of the cultures surrounding Israel, which were highly superstitious, highly focused on all kinds of demons, ghosts, etc., it's not that the Hebrews didn't believe in it, but because of the fact that, one, the Torah, the Jewish law, explicitly condemned any kind of connection or interaction with spirits, no necromancy, no summoning, no fortune telling, no witchcraft. That kind of minimized it. And the other thing is there was such a focus on the unity and the single monotheistic faith of Yahweh that these lesser spirits, even things like angels and demons, really take a back seat for a large part of the Old Testament. Now, that being said, there are a handful of references in the Old Testament. Now, if you're coming from a non-Catholic or non-Orthodox Christian background, whether you're not Christian at all or you're a Protestant, unfortunately, many of these references are found only in books of the Old Testament in which Catholics and Orthodox hold on to. That being said, whether you accept them as scripture or not, you'll at least get an idea and a feel for what the people of that time period believed. And we see as it carries over to in the New Testament, which we all share, that we're going to have similar ideas. But what are some of these stories? Well, one is in a book called the Book of Wisdom. And the Book of Wisdom has one section where it basically retells the story in a very spiritualized, extensive way of the plagues of on Egypt, the 10 plagues. And when it gets to the plague, one of the plagues was 3 days of darkness that fell on Egypt. Now, if you go back to the actual story in Exodus, it just talks about the darkness, so dark you can't see, you could actually feel it in a sense, it was so powerful. And that's kind of where it stops. In the Book of Wisdom, though, we're told that not only did they experience this darkness, but in this darkness, they experienced, quote, fearsome apparitions that would terrorize the people, keeping them in their homes. And although as they experienced this darkness, they also experienced these spirits apparitions, deceased people who were allowed by God to sort of come in and terrorize them for whatever reason. Ghosts in the traditional sense. Now, another one, also coming from these additional books, comes from the book of Maccabees. And Maccabees, for those who aren't familiar with those books, is really the story of the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. And at one point, there's a battle. And the general of the battle, Judas Maccabeus, after the battle is over, he goes out to basically claim the Jewish dead, give them a proper burial. Right? They're fighting for Israel and its independence. Yet when they go to take these bodies, they discover all these dead Jews are wearing amulets that are sacred to idols. And so there's sort of a fear of what's going to happen. And so they send this sacrifice. They try to, which shows us the understanding of a place after death as well, that you can make atonement. Because here you have Jews that for most part were holy religious men fighting for Israel in the covenant. And yet out of some weakness of human nature, just as a secondary chance, they're like, well, I better be sure and have my amulet too. So you have this understanding of this place that you can atone for after a person has died, as long as they've died sort of in a state of grace, but just with certain sins connecting to them.
So these soldiers, in addition to as a plan B backup, they had amulets that were
right.
idols.
Exactly.
In case Yahweh didn't save them.
Right. Like okay. Rabbit's foot today or something,
Oh, okay. Okay.
Or like glass on the Pope Mobile, right? We know God protects the Holy Father, but just in case. Just kidding.
If I were Pope, I would want the bulletproof glass.
Yeah, I'd want the bulletproof glass too, actually, especially in this day and age.
Mm-hmm.
Judas then and this Judas is not Judas of the New Testament.
Wait, real quick. The tale from Wisdom, from the Book of Wisdom, about the darkness in the plagues of Egypt was like night terrors where people would see apparitions.
Yeah, fearsome apparitions. So
I want to see that version.
Yeah,
of Prince of Egypt.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Judas now, not the Judas of the New Testament, the betrayer of Jesus, but Judas in the Old Testament. He then he relates to his soldiers the next day that he has had an experience, and in his experience, 2 deceased men have come to visit him. One is the recently martyred high priest of Israel, a man named Ananias. And Ananias is accompanied by a man who looks very regal, long beard, gray hair, very regal looking. And these 2 spirits appear to Judas. And Judas actually asks Ananias, who is this man with you, this holy man? And it turns out that it's the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah pronounces prophecy over that Israel will have victory over the Greeks and retake the temple. And then the high priest Onias actually hands Judas a flaming sword. And so after he takes the sword, the 2 men disappear, and then the sword disappears, but Judas is filled with this great understanding and power that 2 of the deceased men in glory, so to speak, have been allowed by God to return to speak to him, to talk to him. Now, the third and most famous ghost story from the Old Testament, though, is one that if you're familiar at all, I'm sure you've heard, and that is the story of King Saul and the Witch of Endor. Which, little funny fact, if you used to like the Bewitched show, Grandma's name was Endora, because the Witch of Endor, but anyway.
Any relationship to the Ewoks?
yeah, the moon of Endor. I always think that too, but I don't know, actually.
What is it? Does Endor mean something?
I don't know what it means. The name itself is of a town, but I don't know what the Hebrew means for the word Endor.
I think George Lucas was just flipping through his Bible. And then he saw a word that he really liked.
Yeah.
I mean, there you go.
So, in the story, Saul has broken God's law. He's the king of Israel, but he's broken God's law so many times that when he finds himself in a crisis, basically he has no relationship with the Lord anymore. So he's getting no, quote, word from God, no confidence. So rather than sort of throwing himself on God's mercy, which may have had an effect on how God treated him, he goes even further and breaks God's law and his own law, which he had done in place of God, and that is he seeks out a medium to call up the ghost, the spirit, the shade of the old prophet Samuel, the man who himself had anointed Saul as king by God's command. It's found in the first book of Samuel, chapter 28. And what's interesting about the story, which really bothered a lot of the, I won't say the early Christians, but the mid-level, sort of the 300s, 400s, as the early story wasn't even talked about by the fathers. By the time you get to Augustine and Tertullian and these famous fathers of the church, a lot of them really don't like this story because it doesn't accord with the philosophy they have, not necessarily the biblical understanding. Tertullian said it was a demon, straight out. He says it was not the ghost of Samuel, it was a demon. Augustine,
seems like the ghost, if it was a demon, was giving really good advice.
Yeah.
Though.
The other thing is, the funny thing is, he's actually annoyed too. He says, "Why did you wake me up?"
Yeah.
So
yeah, basically he scolds him for doing this, right? I don't think a demon would do that.
And he prophesizes one last time in a terrible prophecy. He basically says, "And by tomorrow night, you and your sons will be here with me," meaning that Saul and all of his children will be dead. Now, later, the Bible will refer to this in 3 other books. Not in great detail, but they will refer to this each time about the great sin of contacting the dead. And although in today's episode we are not going to talk a lot about the difference between, quote, necromancy and consulting the dead, like with Ouija boards and stuff, as opposed to what does it mean to have saints intercede for you, because it might on a superficial level seem the same, but it's very different. That being said, it's clear that the sins of playing around with anything that could lead to contact with spirits is outside of God's law is really dangerous, truly dangerous. And I will just say that as a Catholic, that is danger. And we're not talking about demons today, but you can be guaranteed that those spirits that are contacted, they may claim to be human, they may claim to be this, but it's unlikely that they are. We'll find out why that is as we go a little further into our stories about what these spirits are. So the book of Sirach says he prophesies one last time from the grave to put an end to evil. Chronicles talks about this. So there was a great horror in the Israelite understanding of what Saul had done to try to seek knowledge from the dead. So that's about it. Those are really the only 3 stories, and 2 of them aren't even found in Protestant Bibles today, Old Testaments, that deal with ghosts.
So, real quick, you had you mentioned that for Augustine and Tertullian, their philosophy prevented them from really accepting that this could be a disembodied human spirit.
Right.
Does that have something to do with them being Platonists? Or
partially for Augustine, although ironically Plato did believe in ghosts.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
We've been reading in our Great Books Club that tons of Plato, where I mean he references.
I think it's Phaedo or Phaedrus. He talks about the spirits that. Now, since you brought up Plato, this wasn't in the main notes, but I did, as I was going through the research, see this, and I do think Plato hit on something correct for the wrong reasons, because Platonism in its total form of this separation of body and soul is not Christian understanding. But one thing he said I think is correct. Now, it was based on Plato's view that the real important part of us is our, quote, soul or spirit, and the body is at best kind of a vessel that we just have to deal with, or at worst almost like a prison. So what Plato said was, when the soul dies, or when the body dies, the soul is freed now, and it goes to the place of ideas. He said, however, the more connected to earthly things a soul is, the more difficulty it will have passing on from this earth. It doesn't want to leave. So in a sense, Plato kind of anticipates what a lot of modern ghost people talk about, needing them to move on. As
unfinished business.
Unfinished business.
Right.
An unwillingness to leave behind their house, their possessions, their relatives, whatever it is, as we look at this in more Christian understanding. But he did kind of hit on something. We also, jumping ahead a little bit, but some of you may have heard the name Adam Bly. If not, look for his stuff on YouTube. He has a few books that are great. He's a psychologist?
I think so.
He's not a priest, but he works...
Like in the psychiatric field or something.
And he's Catholic. He works with the... an exorcism organization for the United States. He's one of the few non-clergy a part of that. But he's done extensive research and been present at these kind of things. You can look him up and Google it. But he says that in connection with that kind of idea too, that many of these deceased human spirits that are having trouble moving on, for whatever reason, it's often connected to a violent death. Murder, car accident out of the blue, something that shockingly happens that someone is not prepared for, and there's some kind of crazy violence that kind of happens so quick, almost as if the soul's not ready, not prepared, not in any way.
Is that why you think we probably hear so many of these modern ghost stories and like hauntings in places where there's been something like that happen, or like the famous Alcatraz ones,
right?
It's like mass murderers.
Do you think it has to do with justice, like feeling there's an unjust that happens, and so God allows that?
Sometimes. What Bly will say later, and we could make a whole topic out of this one, because what we tend to think of when we hear about ghost stories, the knocking, smelling scents of a person who's deceased, like perfume they used to wear.
The flowers that they were there at their burial.
A feeling of sadness. Bly connects that to the fact that at least in the Catholic experience of exorcists, those are almost always connected to a suicide person. Someone who has killed themselves, taken their own life, and now is sort of trapped or trying to not make good, but in some way resolve what they did. And one of the things we'll mention as we're getting on in it is that as we're going to see, God, depending on where that soul is after death, they have less or more freedom to be able to return to our world or not because of their state and where they are in relationship to God. Moving on, though, let's look at the New Testament. Again, the New Testament does not really talk about ghosts. It does, however, make it clear that at least the people of Jesus' time, including the apostles, did believe in ghosts. So, for example, when Jesus walked on water, they thought he was a ghost. When he first returned in the resurrection, they thought he was a ghost, at which Jesus says, "I'm not a ghost. Touch me, feel me, I have flesh and bones." Which, that's a whole other story. Why does a resurrected body need bones? But anyway, we also know from the book of Acts that the Pharisees, unlike the Sadducees, believed in angels, quote, spirits. Some might also include the appearance of Moses and Elijah to Jesus at the Transfiguration. By far the strangest story, however, is found only in Matthew's Gospel. At the moment of Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross, we're told, quote, tombs were opened, and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep, that is, who had died, were raised. And coming forth from their tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. So you have a whole group of ghosts appearing to people, then presumably moving on.
I read this, and it's like every Easter, this one is red. And it's like glossed over. What the heck happened?
Yeah. And
what happened?
It doesn't mean their bodies were resurrected. It was...
Yeah.
I don't know.
It doesn't...
Their tombs were open.
It's so unclear. It says they're raised, which normally means resurrected, but...
So when we researched this in my master's program, in my biblical theology course, we were asked what we thought by our professor. What did we think happened? Because there's really no conclusive answer, right?
No.
Is it that the tombs opened, literally,
right?
And like Lazarus, a bunch of people came out and went to their families and said, "Hey, we're in good shape, and we're gonna ascend or whatever when the gates of heaven are open for us? Or is it that there were visions of these righteous ancestors of Jews who are contemporary of that time, right?
Right.
Was it that their ancestors who had gone before them that were in their tombs, their spirits sort of appeared to them or something and let them know that we're okay? The Lord has risen from the dead and
Right.
we're, I don't know.
It's
But
such a
wait,
weird thing.
Because the tombs didn't open at the resurrection.
It says they appeared after the resurrection.
Oh, after the resurrection.
Well, here's what it says. It says at the moment Jesus died,
mm-hmm.
there's that earthquake. So some people, because I remember when I was teaching Matthew, some scholars say, well, the tombs being ripped open is kind of connected to the earthquake, a supernatural event. But then it's unclear because it says tombs were opened and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised. But it says, but they came forth from their tombs after his resurrection. They entered the holy city and appeared to many. So it is kind of first unclear, the chronology, but the appearance happens after the resurrection. So, yeah, this is one of the strangest biblical passages you can even figure.
So is it figurative? Is it? What do you think?
I don't know. Matthew's the only one who records it, which makes it difficult. He's connecting it directly to this event that has happened historically. The crucifixion happens, the temple veil rips, the earthquake occurs all simultaneously, and then it seems to see that he flows right into that. The tombs are opened and then things happen.
I mean, I don't want to sound too historical critical.
Right, yeah.
But he is the only one that mentions it. You would think if he did, and especially if Luke did, you know, be like, okay, well, the historian of the group, he recorded that one down, but only Matthew.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, and going along your line of thought, Matthew writing to other Jews, it's not clear to me exactly what this would appeal to in Jewish Christians as opposed to Gentile ones, so I really don't know. Not to mention, it's just kind of odd from everything else we know that no one will receive their bodies until the resurrection, except for Christ, and for Catholics we understand Mary has. So that makes it odd too, because like Quinn asked, well, are they already raised? Are they resurrected? It seems to indicate that, but not clearly, because it uses the term raised, but they appeared. Who knows? It's just a very odd statement. I guess what we can say to sum up the New Testament is not a lot either, except that people in Jesus' time believed in ghosts. They believed they were immaterial, right? They can float on water, or appear to walk on water. And they seemed, every time they appear, or the apostles think they appear, they're terrified of them. So clearly ghosts were not seen in a positive light. No one should be walking around as a ghost for a good reason, which we're going to see Christianity as it moves forward in its understanding of things, kind of, it modifies that a little bit to understand these different places that ghosts and such arise from.
When Peter is released from prison?
Yes.
And then he goes back to where all the other disciples of Jesus are hiding out, right?
Right.
In Acts of the Apostles, and then he knocks at the door, and the guy at the door sees him, and he goes in and tells everybody.
Right. Rhoda, she sees the... Yeah.
Oh, her.
Yeah.
Okay, so she goes back in and says, Peter's at the front door. They say that's not Peter, it's his angel
because
in English, right?
Right.
Or is it, what is the Greek that's used?
It is.
Is it angel?
Yeah, it is agolos.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Which, not wanting to get into angels, but that says something very interesting too about...
Well, I was just curious, is it...
Okay, so having kind of narrowed our criteria, talked about disembodied souls of the deceased human beings, as Catholics we understand that there are 3 states in which such ghosts, that is human spirits, can arise from. 1, they can be those humans who are suffering eternal damnation, that is the damned suffering eternal death in hell. They can be deceased human beings who are enjoying glorious salvation, those of the saints in heaven. Or they can be those deceased humans who are undergoing the temporary purification of their sins, the so-called suffering or holy souls of purgatory. So any ghost that is encountered, we as Catholics or Christians in general would believe, has to be a person who exists in one of these states. The question, though, becomes, why would they appear to and interact with us who are living? Why would they bother to come down and do this? Now, what's interesting is even as great a Catholic authority as St. Thomas Aquinas, whose biographer tells us himself experienced 2 ghost appearances.
Ooh.
One of his Dominican brothers, and the other one of a friend or maybe even a sister who he wasn't even aware was dead at the time.
Whoa.
So I don't know the stories in great detail. I saw it when I was going through the stories, but here he had personal experiences. But he does try to answer the question. And his basic answer is, generally speaking, disembodied, deceased human souls, spirits, are confined to their respective after-death abodes. Just in the same way that you and I, as human beings, living human beings, are confined in our own, quote, reality. Right? We can't pass into heaven or hell or purgatory at will, except in special spiritual states, generally with which God would have to grant us, not by our own power. However, having said that, Aquinas says, God, for his own reasons, does allow deceased souls to leave their abodes and appear to the living on earth. Then he actually sets forth, and this is all in the Summa, so this is high-level Catholic understanding, even if it's only Catholic theology and not doctrine. But he then answers the question, why would a group, one from each place, return? So for the saints, those who are in heaven, he says they can, because of divine grace, quote, appear whenever they will to the living.
Whenever they will.
Whenever they will. Knowing, in a sense, knowing that they're not gonna go against God's will, but it seems that they have the freedom to kind of interact anywhere they want.
Oh, that's really interesting, then.
Whenever they will. And he says the reason they generally come is to teach, to heal, and to encourage the living. So that's why the saints from heaven would appear. Now, the damned, and this one's kind of interesting, those who are in hell, they lack the gift of divine grace. And because of that, they are, quote, unable to appear unless permitted by God. Why would God let the damned come? And he gives 2 reasons. To instruct the living, and you may remember the story in Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Although denied, the rich man who's in hell does ask Jesus, may I return, or can you return to let them know how bad this place is? So there is an understanding that they can instruct us. At least Aquinas says that. But he says more often it's done to intimidate the living. I guess to literally put the fear of hell in people so that maybe they'll repent is why God would allow it.
Spiritual gargoyles?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, and actually,
makes sense.
And there is a whole, not for today, but we'll read at some point what's called the letter from hell, which is from a nun that she received from a damned soul that she knew. And it kind of reveals a lot of crazy stuff that I was unaware of it until I started doing the research. But that's the damned. Then the suffering souls, those who are in purgatory, they, quote, may be permitted, because they do have grace, but still not the level of interaction with God the saints do, but they may be permitted to appear to living in order to seek our prayers. So in order to reconnect with us. If the saints then, Aquinas then goes on to answer the question, if the saints can appear anytime they want, why don't they appear all the time? And this was something that really bothered Augustine. In fact, Augustine, when I read his, is very interesting because on the one hand, Augustine knows that there was a lot of, even in his time, a lot of worthy, holy men and women, Christians, who have had experiences with the deceased. And he doesn't want to say that they're lying or mistaken because he knows these are people of character. On the other hand, Augustine, coming from his own personal experience of the loss of his mother, at one point doesn't make a theological argument, he makes a personal one. He says, if this is true, why wouldn't my mother have ever come and seen me? So part of his comes from a place of, which you can understand that question, but he doesn't actually answer the question. But now Aquinas tries. He says, well, The saints are so wholly conformed to the divine will that they won't appear to us, although they can, unless they're explicitly told to do so by God. And for those in purgatory, they're often, he says, so overwhelmed with what they need to do in order to compensate for their sins that they don't have the desire often to appear to others. So at times, however, they can and do return. Now at that point, let's look at sort of one of our first little saint stories about a deceased spirit. And this involves a saint named St. John Bosco. And I admit myself, I don't know a lot about John Bosco. But in his early years in seminary, he developed a close friendship with a fellow seminarian named Louis Camolio. Camolio died suddenly and unexpectedly, and it caused John Bosco great grief. In fact, he even had moments of doubt in his faith because of the death. Ironically, the two men early on had made a pact with each other that whichever of them died first, both thinking they would be priests by this time, they were seminarians, whichever of them died first, they would give the other person some indication of the state of their soul after death. So you have this funny, strange pact that these two young guys make, you know. So one does die much earlier, unexpectedly. And so John Bosco, we're told, and this is from his own diary, he said he waited breathlessly throughout the entire wake. Nothing. He waited again in anticipation the next day throughout the funeral and burial service. Nothing. Saddened, he returned home. However, the very next day, April 2nd, 1839, the day following Camollo's funeral, something amazing occurred that was witnessed by over 20 people apart from John Bosco. He was in the common dormitory studying with around 20 some odd other seminarians when suddenly, and I'll read what he said. He says, near the stroke of midnight, a deep rumble was heard at the end of our corridor. It became deeper and louder as it drew nearer. It sounded like a large cart or a railway train, even artillery fire. Some were scared that this was in fact what it was. I still don't know after all these years how to describe that sound adequately, except to say it was a mixture of throbbing and violent sounds that would leave us all utterly terrified and frightened, too frightened for words. As the noise drew nearer and nearer, the whole ceiling, walls, and floor of the hallway began to vibrate, as if they were sheets of metal struck by the hand of a mighty giant. The sound approached and became so difficult to even pinpoint how close it was. All of the seminarians now were awoke throughout the entire dormitory. No one spoke. We all sat frozen with fear. The noise came nearer and nearer, grew more frightening. It reached the dormitory. The door then slammed open, but there was nothing to see. A moment later, a ghostly, multicolored light that seemed to control the sound arose. Then silence. In that silence, the light intensified, and I heard Camollo's voice, as did the others, as clear as day, distinctly say, Bosco, Bosco, I am saved. And at that moment, the dormitory grew bright, the noise erupted once, long and loud, like thunder, the house seemed collapsed, then it all stopped, everything vanished, and it appeared as if nothing had occurred. So we don't have an apparition, but we have a ghostly voice heard by big manifestations of a lot of people.
Stanley Kubrick movie.
Right, a shining. We do have the glow. There is something manifested. And like I said, this was a widely seen by people. It's recorded in his diary. So you have this odd incident. Now, another story. Now looking kind of at the damned, because Aquinas tells us the damned can appear. St. Martin of Tours had become recently the bishop of his city, and he was informed over time that there was a corpse, a body, in a nearby chapel which was being venerated as a martyr and saint by the local populace, and it had visibly manifested in spirit to several members of his congregation. So Martin is skeptical about this, but he open to the possibility this could be the fact. So he goes through a rigorous investigation into the matter, saying, who is this man? What did he do? Like, is this a martyr that we really should be venerating and everything else? but he couldn't find out anything. Nothing about the man's life, nothing about his merits. So finally, he himself goes alone one night to the sepulchre where the body is, praying to Christ that the truth would be shown to him of who this person is. As he prays, he tells us he looked towards the left side of the altar, and there was a dark and obscure man-shaped shadow. Using a blessed crucifix and holy water, he surrounded it and seemingly kept it intact in this corner. Then he compelled it by the Spirit of Christ to answer and demanded of it who it was and what he was doing. The Spirit, fully visible, admitted that he was a thief who had been executed for his crimes and damned, but he was posing as a saint in the attempt to get people to fall into sin. Martin then expelled him with an exorcism and commanded the altar be immediately destroyed and the body buried in a common grave. So we have the story. Again,
so he was being venerated.
He was being venerated, pretending to be a saint after death in order to lead others astray. And he admits
so
he's
after
damned.
death, you can have that level of agency.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So
to just play a scheme on a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. It's
and all for the sake of just.
It's sort of like the devil's deception, but in a very particular way that he actually uses it.
That's really interesting.
But that's the weird story is we don't know. Like you read a story like that, and the guy's not necessarily there to intimidate. Like Aquinas said, it seems more like God is allowed, because he would have to allow. The devil can't control that.
Yeah.
Insofar as God would, it is interesting of what God would allow the damned to kind of do to an extent in this world. So we've seen that an example of one of the glorious saints returning as a, quote, ghost, one of the damned returning as a ghost. But really, in terms of the accounts, both in Scripture and at least in the lives of the saints, the vast majority seem to be ghostly encounters with people from purgatory. Now, in fact, the common widespread belief, even in the secular world, regarding ghosts, that they roam the earth because they cannot, quote, cross over, is probably itself derived from the understanding of Catholic teaching that those who died in unfinished state, in not enough need to perform some kind of action to kind of help them along, so to speak. So it's sort of a garbled version of what purgatory is, but it may point to something real in what's happening. Now, many non-Catholics and even many Catholics probably don't fully understand purgatory. And while we won't get into it entirely here, the point is purgatory is the state, place, however you want to understand it, of after death purification. Only the saved go to purgatory. So let's just make that clear. It's anyone who has died in a state of grace but not fully perfected to the point that they can enter into the glory of God. So the church teaches, quote, all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. So it's the saved. But after death, they undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. So you have these souls in various states of, or various levels of their cleansing, I guess you'd say, they're perfecting. Now, the idea of an after-death cleansing does not come from Catholicism. We derived it from Judaism. I already mentioned the book of Maccabees, praying for the dead. The term purgatory itself, Latin, simply means cleansing. In fact, if you lived in Rome, you would take your clothes to a purgatorium. So the word itself is kind of non-threatening in its real sense. It's simply referring to that process occurring. And the church is clear that this final purification is entirely different from the punishment of the damned, in that it's cleansing, it's purifying, and it perfects the person who's it's happening to. It has always been, at least as far as the church has ever mentioned it, it has always been the church's teaching that our prayers are offered for the deceased. So those of you who are Catholic know we say masses, and we always have a mass intention. Most often that's someone who's passed away, not always. So these prayers for the deceased and religious practices on their behalf, doing penances for these holy souls, have to help them in this process of their purification is written right into the fabric of our Catholic life. Whereas surrounding pagan cultures tended to connect the appearance of ghosts to improper burials, not keeping certain rites, what we see in Christianity as it arises in the ancient world is it views these purgatorial spirits as returning in order to sort of make restitution for some wrong, or to ask and plead for the fact of prayers that they need in order to help free them more quickly, or I guess not free them is the right thing as much as to help them along quicker through this process they're experiencing in purification.
And that is probably because the purification might not be very comfortable.
Right. Yes.
Now, I was always told by my grade school teachers in Catholic school that purgatory, it could be painless. It could be just in the blink of an eye. You pass through this sort of state of being not prepared for the weight of the glory of heaven, and then all of a sudden you are. But I think you introduced me to a book. I forget the name of the book, but it's about the Purgatory Museum in Italy, in Rome.
Yeah.
So I've been to Rome 5 times, and I had no idea there was a Purgatory Museum where there's like relics of like priest chasubles, priest lectionaries, and like all sorts of different sacramentals that are used during Mass, where as the Mass is being said, souls have reached out from purgatory with like hands that are on fire and have burned these garments and these sacramentals and things, as if they're like pleading for the Mass to be said for them so they can get out of purgatory.
Yeah, it's and I would look that up. Those of you who are interested in seeing
What's the
images,
name of the book? Is it something hands? Something hands?
I don't know. We'll try to put it up maybe in the links after or something.
Yeah. And the website to that too, that museum.
But what you can do in the meantime is look up, the name of the place is the Little Museum of Purgatory. And it's located in Rome, a little farther along the Tiber River than the Vatican, at the Church of the Sacred Heart of Suffrages. Look it up, because you'll get to see images that Justin's mentioning here of handprints, burned handprints into missals, into people's clothing. They've collected hundreds of real artifacts of items touched by these purgatorial, quote, spirits. And so these
I also guarantee if you go to Rome, those places typically have no tourists.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you go to the Vatican and you have to wait hours to go see the Sistine Chapel. But, I mean, you go to see an incorruptible saint, no one knows that they're there. Or the Purgatory Museum, I bet no one knows it's there. So
you'll walk into like a little side street chapel and there'll be like something painted by like one of the great artists.
Yeah.
Raphael or something. Like, wow, there it is.
Side story, really funny. I was leading a group of students on a tour through Rome. And so we did a whole day at the Vatican. And then the next day we kind of had free. And so I said, well, you guys want to see where the Pope is actually the bishop? And he said, it's not St. Peter's? I said, no, his cathedral is actually St. John Lateran's, and it's like down the way a bit. And they're like, okay. So after going through Vatican City and showing your passport, waiting in lines and getting checked by the Swiss Guard and like all of this stuff, we go up to St. John Lateran's. No kidding, it's just an old dude sitting in a chair at the front of a church. And we just walked right in. So I bet that's what seeing the Purgatory Museum is kind of like.
Sorry, I was going to make a Monty Python joke. Just walk right. Hey! Anyway. So let's do another saint story. And this one now deals with a purgatorial spirit, a spirit that needs help. The mid-1100s, the Irish saint Malachi had refused to continue to have any relationship with his sister because of her sinful life, and it had become so repellent to him and the rest of the family. What she did, what she was into, we have no idea. He never describes it. After her death, however, he did feel compelled, because of her evil life, to have masses said for her, to pray for her soul. So he offered a few of them. and then he kind of, after a few times, he left it up to Christ. Soon afterwards, however, he could swear that he informed his assistant, I swear I hear her voice at night, just as I'm about to go to sleep. And the assistant said, well, you're just dreaming, such and such. But this would go on for several days, and the voice would actually tell him, meet me in the garden, meet me in the garden. So finally, after several days of this, he finally gets up and says, all right, I'm just going to go and see what is going on, if this is true. He walks into the garden, he gets up, and he actually does encounter his sister. And he said her spirit, her ghost, he could see her, looked pitiful. She just looked horrible. And she told him that she had not eaten for a month. And after which she suddenly disappeared. So he's kind of shaken up a bit. He goes back inside. And as he's thinking about it, he reflects on the fact that he had exactly stopped offering masses a month ago for her, and her complaint that she had not eaten in over a month. So immediately he began to fervently offer masses again for her, and he would see her ghost on multiple occasions. The first time he sees her, she's now dressed all in black, and she was standing right at the door of the church, not yet able to enter. Several weeks later, he sees her a second time. Now she's clothed in white, and she's actually inside the church. Finally, after about a month and a half after this, he sees her one last time near the altar in the sanctuary, glowing, smiling, and shining. And afterwards, he relates, he knows that she had moved on. So here you have a story of a person who needed prayers to help them move on, which is what many of the ghosts that people encounter are probably more of this variety. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Adam Bly before. This is what he says. He says, typical indicators that a purgatorial spirit is present include, but are not limited to, quote, the sounds of a person walking or pacing, odors associated with that deceased, knocks on the walls, and often a heavy, sad feeling. Quote, the most common type of human spirit haunting cases are the souls of people who have committed suicide as well as murder victims. These souls usually create a very strong feeling and an effect of sadness, depression, and malaise near where they die. They often cause some manifestation, knocking, banging, which often occurs at the time of day at which they died or when they are being talked about by others in the vicinity. So here you have an expert talking as kind of what that is. And as I mentioned already, Plato already seemed to think that those who are already tied to this world more for some reason appear more likely. We have this connection to violence. So for whatever reason, it seems that these intense things that occur to people are more likely to kind of, need to be worked out maybe. Yeah. These intense feelings at the moment of death need to be kind of finally worked through by the person in grace and through prayers in order to maybe move on.
There's a famous Filipino story that goes along those lines of a priest named Father Cipriano Ergel, who ended up becoming an archbishop.
Oh, okay.
There was a new I forget the name of the archdiocese where he became the first archbishop, but he was at his parish church just praying, and he was newly assigned there. And he was praying in Latin because it was prior to Vatican II, the prayers for the dead, and he would say the opening portion of the Hail Mary, and then he'd hear other voices in the church at night finishing the Hail Mary, doing the response. So Sancta Maria Mater Dei, they would say the rest of it, and he would look up and see no one in the church with him, and so he would keep on praying, and the more it happened, the more freaked out he got. And so the first night it happened, he stopped. He's like, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm a little freaked out. I'm going to go back to the rectory and go to sleep. So the next night he does it again. And again, he starts the Ave Maria, and then he hears Sancta Maria Mater Dei, just this weird kind of, but the voices now, it went from like one voice to more, and then every night, more and more voices started chiming in, to the point where he realized something special is going on. So he kept on praying every night, the prayers for the dead, and then eventually the voices started diminishing until there was only one left, and then there was none. So he found out after the fact that his parish was built on top of an old cemetery, but the cemetery wasn't, I believe it wasn't particularly Catholic or a Christian cemetery or anything. It was just dead people were buried there. And so he realized, oh, these souls were calling out to me to pray for them so that they could have peace. And then they moved on, and that's why the voices stopped.
Right.
Yeah. It's a very popular, I probably got a lot of it wrong, but it's a popular Filipino story. There was another one, and I'd be curious to see in your research.
So I have to laugh because look at Quinn's face. She looks so skeptical. She's like, what? Sorry.
He's an archbishop.
Well,
No question.
I was just wondering too, because souls in purgatory can't pray for themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. They reach out and ask for us to pray for them.
Can they ask other souls in purgatory to pray for them?
I don't know.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. To offer their suffering in purgatory for some other soul in purgatory?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, because you see it, you're like, oh.
I don't know. It's very interesting. We'll find out when we're in purgatory. God willing. There is another story that I had found that was a recent one, but it was similar, of a college student who lived in a dorm, right, with his roommate. They're both going to university together. And the problem was this particular guy, Filipino guy, he really, this is so stereotypical, had a hard time waking up in time for class. So he asked his roommate, can you wake me up so I can get to class on time? And the roommate was like, always saying like, okay, sure, every day I'll wake you up and you can get to class on time. And so one day the roommate shows up and I think it's the evening and tells this guy like, I need you to pray for me. No matter what, always pray 3 Hail Marys and like 3 Our Fathers for me. Offer them up for me and for all the souls in purgatory. And you will wake up on time for your class without me having to wake you up. And so this guy is like, okay, well, I'll keep praying for you. And every morning prays for him. And he thinks it's weird because the roommate does disappear. Like, where is my roommate? Well, the campus security starts smelling something disgusting in like one of the locker areas of the university. And so they open up one of the lockers, and it happens to be the roommate had committed suicide and he died within the locker. Like his body, I don't know what he did, but he committed suicide and had died inside of his locker. And so his spirit had appeared to the guy and was like, hey, pray for me so that you'll wait, and I'll make sure you wake up. But you need to pray for me and for all the other souls in purgatory, basically. It's really interesting.
That is really cool.
Yeah. Now, for Filipinos, I was going to say, I imagine that in your research, did you see how many Filipino, like what the percentage?
It was a high percentage.
It's got to be
like
high,
80s
man.
or 90s.
Oh, yeah, because you talk to my mom, my grandparent, or my grandma, my like aunts and uncles and stuff, without question. It's like we've all been visited.
Weren't you talking about, you were telling me that your daughter was like mentioning deceased people who she didn't know.
Okay.
And when you told your mom, she's just like, oh yeah, I've seen them too. Or something like that.
I was just going to bring this up because I was going to say, you're Irish.
Yeah.
So I imagine there's tons of visitings that happen within your family. I don't know if you've been visited yourself, but my daughter, about 9 months ago, started telling me the names of, she would have been 2.5 years old at the time, started telling me the names of all of her toys, and she would call them names of deceased family members that she had never met, with names that are not common.
Right.
So
yeah, because we know Filipino names.
Yeah. Sunny Boy.
Yeah.
I know a guy named Sunny Boy.
Sunny Boy.
It's not his nickname.
Tito Boy. Got a lot of those. And like every auntie is baby. So she had a doll. She named it Auntie Maita. Like, how many people do you know named Maita?
Right.
You know what I mean? And she had another doll that she named Uncle Menti. First of all, how do you know not just Maita, but it's Auntie Maita? Not just Menti, but Uncle Menti. And then she told me that she named one of her dolls Johnny, which sounds, that's a common American. Like, you would hear that watching TV and stuff. So it's like, maybe she picked that up from TV. And then she told me, Johnny comes to me sometimes and he tells me that he loves me and that he's really happy with our family and that when we're happy, he's happy. I said, wow, that's very interesting. So I'm thinking, so Johnny was the very common nickname of my grandfather, who is deceased as of 1997. My Auntie Maita died from, I believe it was a stroke. She passed out and died in their family house. Like, I forget how long ago. It was a long time ago. My Uncle Menti died of natural causes from old age, and that was several years ago. And these are all people that my 2.5-year-old daughter would never have met, and yet she's naming toys after them and stuff. So I told my mom, I said, Mom, I think my daughter, Rafi, she might be getting visited by family members who have passed away. And my mom, good Filipino woman, goes, well, of course she is. She's the oldest daughter, Of course she's getting visited by them because they never got to meet her in person in this life. And so they want to, like, be there in some way for her, like, now. I thought that was very interesting. And I said, well, it seems, Mom, like, this is not a very big deal.
Yeah.
And I mean that our deceased family members are appearing to my oldest daughter. And she said, well, we're Filipino. I mean, it's just what happens. Very interesting, right? I mean, you've got to have tons of stories like that from your family. You're Irish?
There's just a lot of weird stories, but not any in my particular.
You're more like leprechauns and pixies and stuff, right?
The fairies.
Weird
things like lock all the windows when a new baby is born so that none of the fairy creatures can get in and change the baby and weird things like that.
Whoa! We have one where if a family member dies, you have to unlock the door so that the spirit can come out.
Orthodox Jews drill a hole in their homes so that there's a place for the spirit to leave when it comes out, and you have to cover all the mirrors and things in the house.
Whoa!
Why mirrors?
Because that's where without getting too far into it, that's where
mirrors?
there's evil things in the mirrors that will come. That's how they used to come into the home and stuff in order to grab the spirit when it's still new
through optical stuff. Wow, that's crazy.
So Orthodox Jews drill a hole in their home. Like, you might have $1 million home, you like have a hole through it.
Now, this isn't really a ghost thing, but it's an interesting Filipino cultural thing where we usually have an altar in the house where we keep all of our sacramentals and our Bibles and candles and what have you, like statues and everything. And always during big holidays, we would always leave out food for deceased family members. It sounds so paganistic and like it's an offering, but that's not what it was. It was just like
ancestry worship.
No, it was more like we're thinking about you and how much we miss you, and that's why we're sacrificing this portion of our meal and we're going to put it here with all of our sacred statues and stuff, And my family hasn't really done that in our household, but it's because my wife and I never host any of the big holidays,
Right.
But if you were to go to my grandmother's house on either side, that's what they do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How about you, Quinn? Any cool stuff like that in your Vietnamese culture?
It's kind of funny because you guys, I'm a huge skeptic. So when I hear stuff like this, I'm like, it happens to other people. I feel like I'm so blind to all this. When you mentioned the stuff happening around in the office, and I'm like, don't hear anything. But growing up, my grandma did tell stories, but I just don't remember don't recall a lot.
Or
of
like,
it.
why do the ghost hunting shows
Yeah.
where they go out looking for ghosts? And you know the one I'm talking about. What's the one with the dude bros where he like calls out the ghosts? Ghost Adventures.
Okay. Yeah.
He Zach Baggins. He'll like go into a supposedly super haunted area and just like call out these ghosts. And then tell them you need to do something, make yourself known, and then they'll leave a camera and then like nothing happens.
Yeah.
You know? But I wonder, because I think Adam Blythe talks about this, that those guys, they get visited in a very different way. And their lives end up getting just like mentally, they get messed up by stuff. So they don't get the satisfaction of catching really interesting things on camera. What they do get is, though, a visitation that they don't really want.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, they're
So
antagonizing the spirits. Like some of the stuff I've seen, it's just very.
Yeah, one of the things we'll get into it in a later episode, but really, by virtue of your baptism as a Christian, no matter what type of Christian you are, does give you already a great power and authority over spirits, evil things. But realistically, when we're dealing with the level that they're at least claiming to be after and encountering and looking for, as Catholics, we really believe that requires the sacrament of holy orders, exorcisms, powers that, as a Catholic, I then become skeptical of saying these guys go out. Or I'll hear these stories and they're like, instead of calling a priest, they're like, well, I called my friend who's a Wiccan and she came and put some sage around. And I just kind of think,
there's no authority there.
Yeah, there's no authority. There's no real power. I'm like, I don't know. And, now we're moving again out of the ghost area. But remember, no human being can control a demon by their own power, apart from a priest who does it through the power of Christ. So if you're making pacts, if you think you have some power, they might play you for a while to let you think you do that.
Yeah.
But that demon is not in any way affected by you, the things you're doing. And so I think, but that's for another episode, but that reality that we really have to understand that a lot of these, quote, New Age exorcists, for lack of a better term, and these things, there's I have a lot of skepticism about those particular things and what they're actually able to accomplish, if anything.
So after Augustine,
yeah,
when did we start seeing the church, like the intellectual side of the church being more open to the idea of ghosts?
Yeah, well, Augustine's kind of funny. Because of his authority, he's really this central figure when you look at it, and he addressed it in 3 different places. What's interesting is one of his letters, it's number 159, letter number 159 of Augustine. You can find online, just Google letter 159. Yeah, New Advent, it'll come up. Yeah. But then Google letter 158. Letter 158 is not actually written by Augustine. It's the letter written to Augustine that 159 answers. And it's written by a bishop who is telling Augustine of this saintly deacon who has passed away, very young, and how many people have seen him after death. And what should this bishop do? And in a sense, Augustine sort of like just sets aside the problem. Is like, no, it's probably not, and don't worry about it. But a lot of the questions asked by this man were ones that clearly, even a man with the authority of Augustine, you had these questions that were unanswered, and as purgatory becomes more and more clearly understood, experienced, in a sense, Augustine is just kind of forgotten in that particular area of his teaching, and it moves on, and you see by the time of Aquinas, there's no doubt, a person like Aquinas is just like, certainly there's the...
Well, it just seems like if it was Jewish culture to believe in such things, that Augustine must have been an innovator.
Yeah.
And that he was more against the grain during his time.
That's what most people said, is that he seemed, because of his authority, it may seem bigger than it would normally be, but he was already going against the grain of what Catholicism was already pushing largely by that time. And we already know from the catacombs, we have prayers for the dead, that they knew that they may not have defined and exactly explicated what purgatory was, but it's clear that they're praying for those who have already deceased. And it's not that they think that they're still praying for them to have to be saved, the prayers clearly indicate that there's something, else that they're looking for these people who have passed beyond. But
So you don't think you've ever been visited?
I don't know. I've had weird experiences. None of them that I would say particularly as a ghost. I will say a funny, interesting one, and I've thought about it a lot in my life. And I've had, at times I was annoyed at it, angry, and then I kind of came up with my own understanding of I think what's happening. But after my dad passed away, I'm one of a lot of kids, and I'm next to the youngest. And all of us are still Catholic, some very much so, some sort of barely so. And I have one sister who's not anymore. She's very religious, not Catholic, not even Christian. Well, I shouldn't say she's not Christian. She does still believe in those things. In fact, all her kids are baptized. I'm one of their godparents. But she also believes other stuff. And so my dad passes away. And she's the only one who had some experience of him after death. And even my mom was like, what's going on? Like, why that one? But, and at first I was like, really? Like, why her and all this stuff?
She needed it the most.
But that's what I think after time is she's the one who's furthest from the faith in that sense because she believes a lot of other very different ideas. And maybe she needed that for herself to kind of move forward.
My grandmother and my mother had something similar.
Okay.
Where my grandfather, Johnny, had died. And he was my mom's dad. And so he's deceased. His spirit moves on to the next life. And my mother was visited by him, I think, a couple times. She's sure of it. I don't know what they talk about. I never really asked her. But she was visited at least a couple times by my grandfather after he had died. And my grandmother, later on, not knowing, because my mom kind of kept it secret, later on, not knowing that my mother had been visited by her deceased husband, my grandmother asked my mother, or was telling my mother, I don't know why your dad hasn't visited me yet. He hasn't visited me yet. And she is fully, that's just, I guess that's a Filipino mentality, like, I should get visited at some point. The spirit of my deceased loved one should come and say hi to me. Well, he didn't. He didn't visit his wife. He visited his daughter instead. And my grandmother kind of held a grudge against him for it. And I think she still does. Like, why haven't you visited me? It's been now, 1997 to now? It's been a long time. He just hasn't. And my mom, had to tell her, like, I don't know. She didn't have the heart to tell my grandmother, well, Daddy's visiting me.
Yeah, and it is interesting because
hopefully my grandma doesn't watch this podcast.
Especially because statistically, like it said, 1/3 of all widows or widowers experience their deceased spouse come to them.
Well,
that's one of the most common ones.
Oh my.
I know what I was before. I was thinking when I was doing the research. One of the things that was interesting, going back to my sister and different things like this, is when it comes to people who are most likely to see a ghost, it's very interesting. It falls in the mid-range. If you are non-religious, you're less likely to see one. But here's the other thing: if you're very religious, you're also less likely. The ones who are most likely are moderately religious people, maybe because people like myself, like you were saying, I don't necessarily need it. I don't really need it.
Very interesting.
And those who don't believe aren't open to seeing things or explain it away. Whereas those in the middle kind of, I don't know, but that's statistically that at least I saw 3 or 4 different blogs. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but each one reported the same thing, but in slightly different ways. So I think they're getting the information from somewhere. But yeah.
So because the Virgin Mary went into dormition and was assumed into heaven, body and spirit, we would not, by our criteria that we listed out at the beginning of the podcast, identify her apparitions as ghostly.
She's like disembodied.
Yeah, I don't think so. That's weird because in and of herself, she can't be because she's body and soul. I guess that's a whole other topic we could get into.
What's apparition?
Is the apparition versus the reality? Because, and I ran into some of that as I was going through it too. Is like some people have dreams of dead people a lot, and they're
Oh,
very
I think
accurate.
that happens a lot.
And they'll
right?
tell them
Yeah.
something that turns out to be absolutely true. You know, this is where you find this. This is where this is. But is that a ghost? And if so, how is that different? Because it's not an appearance of a visible thing in waking world. It's a dream. So I mean, there's a lot of places we can go, and
Still a communication of some sort, right?
it is.
Or
And
it
so
could be.
it falls
could be.
into the larger
Yeah.
category. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. So
Would that even be considered paranormal? Because
No, I mean being talked to in your dreams. I think it's a totally different category
Mm-hmm.
when you're awake,
yeah,
and lucid, and using your reason and stuff, and you can see something that.
Tell that to Freddy Krueger, who kills.
Freddy Krueger is a totally different situation.
and I think a simulacrum of some kind of him is in the next season of Stranger Things, because you see the clock and the family that all disappears.
Oh.
It looks nothing like the normal
I
upside
gotta
down.
admit.
Sorry, not to go aside, but it looked. I was
not-
like, wow, I think this is Freddy Krueger, because it shows the clock.
Really?
They're investigating the house now 10 years later.
Season 1 was like one of the most fun things I'd ever seen.
Yeah.
Season 2, I was kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I was falling asleep through it. It didn't like keep my attention the way that season 1 did.
Yeah. Well, and also it's the same story. It's like poor Will. The dude's always the one who gets battered. Like first he disappears, then the second time he's like possessed.
Poor Will, man.
Like he never gets anything. He's always the beat up one. But well, we should probably start to bring this to a close. But we do, as you've seen, we have a lot of unanswered stuff. We've only begun to scratch the surface, and I hope you'll continue to watch. Remember also, the first few we're going to stick with the paranormal, but in several episodes from now, we will do the science side of it, those who are interested in things like the proofs of God from modern physics, things like that. But in our topic, there's so many stories, personal, anecdotal, in the lives of the saints, in scripture, of deceased appearing to the living, that it would take years just to even cover those stories, let alone anything else we did. And there's still so many unanswered questions. We haven't talked about whether human beings can actually contact spirits through occult means. Can we really contact demons, or are the demons fully the ones in control of that? What about animal spirits? There's hundreds of sightings of animal spirits, but that's a whole weird thing, and that's nothing that the church necessarily, or at least they appear as animals. That's, so again, what do we do of those sightings? We haven't spoken really about the difference between a ghostly encounter, an apparition, a vision, a dream. We haven't reflected, and some of you may not know this. I didn't know this till I literally started doing the research for this show. I didn't know there was a difference between a ghost and a poltergeist. A poltergeist is a manifestation of spiritual energy that is not sentient. It's not a person. So what is it? Now, Paul does mention weird things like the stoicheia, the elemental forces. Judaism calls them the...
What's an example of that? Because I've seen the movie Poltergeist.
It's things
and now
that
I think
everything shakes and throws stuff around, but there's no sentient being behind it, but it occurs at different people.
So the movie's kind of correct.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I always assumed that the things moving the chairs into stacks in that movie is a ghost. It's a sentient thing.
Right. So that's why I said I had no idea there was not... We don't know why some ghosts seem to haunt persons, like they appear to persons. Other ones seem bound in some way to a location or a site. Mm-hmm. We just don't know. There's still so much to say about the paranormal. So we do hope you'll continue to join us for new episodes as we present, more of Catholicism, science, and the paranormal. So with that, why don't we sign off, and we hope to see you soon.
All right. God bless
everybody.
God bless
everyone.